Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the market cycle return on investment, or ROI. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, where you can, of course, get access to the charts we'll be talking about in this video. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, there's three primary ways that I think it makes sense to measure the ROI of Bitcoin. Some of these ways I haven't always appreciated, but the more I've done these videos, the more people are like, well, why don't you measure it like that? Why don't you measure it like that? And I, for one, do not want to shy away from data. I want to look at all of it. So what we're going to look at in this video is we're going to look at the ROI of Bitcoin as measured from the low in 2022, the ROI as measured from the peak in 2021, and the ROI after the halving that we had earlier this year. And I think every single way can give us insight into the current market that if we only looked at it in any individual way, we might miss. Okay, now the first thing to look at is the ROI from the low. There is no mistaking the fact that Bitcoin has developed major lows near the end of midterm years, 2014, 2018, 2022. Technically, in 2014 bear market, the low actually occurred in January of 2015. But you can see that there were major lows around that time in all of these cycles, right? Pretty clear. Now, you could also take a low here in November of 2011, which was not around the same time in the cycle, but that was also really early on in Bitcoin's price history. Let's just look at these three cycles as measured from the low. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier this year, back in March, was that there was a high chance that Bitcoin had just gotten ahead of schedule and that it would likely slowly bleed until it got back in line with the prior cycles. And the reason I said that was because the exact same thing happened the cycle before, where it had a rally into the rate cuts. And then as those rate cuts were arriving, you can see that Bitcoin sort of sold off and got back in line with the prior cycle. And so back in March and April and May and June and July, etc., this is what we argued, right? We said, look, there's a good chance that Bitcoin's just going to slowly bleed and get back in line with the prior cycles, right? Now, what's interesting is that it's done that, right? It's done basically exactly what it did last cycle. Rally up ahead of the last cycle, and then slowly get back in line. And you can see that it's done that. What's interesting is while Bitcoin has spent a decent amount of time ahead of the last two cycles, now it's actually below the last two cycles in terms of ROI from the low. Now this is updated obviously on a daily basis. So, with the rally that Bitcoin has experienced today back up to 63K, it's gonna, have this go back up a little bit. But at this point in the last two cycles, 2 cycles ago, Bitcoin was up about 4.36x at this point in the cycle. Last cycle, it was up about 4.73x at this point in the cycle. Today, it's up 3.8x. If you add in the 5% rally that we've had today, it's probably going to get you closer to 4x. But you can see that Bitcoin has done exactly the same thing that it did last cycle, is get ahead of itself, make everyone scream for an immediate move to all-time, to 100K. But in reality, the market just chops around for a while until it's back in line with the prior cycle. So then now the question is, will Bitcoin follow those two cycles and go up into Q4? Right? I mean, we're already in Q4, and so far it hasn't really been the best start to Q4. I mean, the market hasn't really gone anywhere. I think the market opened up around 63K. Bitcoin's still at 63K. Although a lot of times, it's later October when the market starts to move. I don't remember exactly if it did that last year. Last year, you can see it was the week of October 16th where the market got a strong move up. If you go back to 2020, yeah, you can see it was sort of that later October, right? So that would correspond to maybe next week or the week after. If you go back to 2019, and there was also in that, that third to fourth week of October, a big move up, right? That one ultimately resulted in a lower high, but you still saw a fairly strong move by Bitcoin, around the 3rd or 4th week of October. Okay. So right now, it's unclear if it's not just going to follow what it always does, which is, get a push later on in October. Now, it certainly feels like a push today, but, Bitcoin's still basically flat for the week. So we'll have to see what happens later on this month. So when you measure things from the low, it looks like Bitcoin is due to start moving up soon if it's going to follow the last 2 cycles. Now, one thing you might think is, well, hold on a second, Ben. Aren't you bearish on ETH in Q4? I am. And I've made the reasons as clear as I can. The last 2 years, 2016, 2019, when ETH Bitcoin broke down, ETH USD dropped in Q4, right? I could be wrong about that, and that's why I think it makes sense to hedge, right? I've said that. I mean, ETH Bitcoin has already gone to 0.03 to 0.04. It's there right now, right? So after all this time, people telling me it was ridiculous to wait for this range, here we are. So this is a great time to start hedging back, especially if ETH does not go down in Q4. But I think there's a disconnect sometimes between my views on ETH and my views on Bitcoin, and I'm hoping that this might help clear it up. In 2016, Q4, Bitcoin went up. This is October, November, December, right? Q4 2016, Bitcoin went up. But Q4 2016, you might assume that Ethereum went up, but it actually went down, right? And it wasn't the only one, right? There were some other cryptocurrencies that went down back in Q4 of 2016. I'm trying to remember what. I mean, frankly, there weren't a lot of cryptocurrencies trading back then. Litecoin, let's see what Litecoin was doing back in, if this even has it on the chart. Yeah, I mean, it was going down in Q4 of 2016, right? So sometimes I think people assume that if it happens for Bitcoin, or if it happens for ETH, it has to happen for Bitcoin. That's not necessarily true, right? You could have a scenario where Bitcoin goes up in Q4 and ETH does not follow it. Now, I know that might sound crazy, right? And it very well could be. But even today, if you look at the monthly return of Bitcoin, it's currently basically flat, right? But it's negative 0.56%. But for Ethereum, it's negative 5.5%. So it's not like it's that crazy of an idea, right? I mean, it could happen. And the reason I've talked about it for Ethereum is because 2016 ETH has been a perfect match to 2024 ETH so far in terms of monthly candles. And back then, September was green, just like this September was, but then October, November, December were red, even though Bitcoin went up. This is why Bitcoin dominance is important, right? It's a statement of, I don't know which way Bitcoin's going to go, but if it goes up, I want exposure to it. And if it goes down, it's probably not going to go down as much as the altcoin market, right? So it's a good way to have exposure to the upside in crypto while also minimizing your downside risk. Now, one of the interesting things is that, a lot of people like to compare this cycle to the 2016 cycle, and it looks pretty similar, right? I mean, it you can't deny it. It looks really similar. Now, obviously, it ebbs and flows, right? So there's always a good chance that it's in the middle of either ebb or flow, where it's it was above it, and now it's kind of back below it. But it's been a pretty good match so far. And yes, it's below it now, but it's also spent a lot of time above it at various points. It could just be kind of in this phase where it's back below it again for a while. But one of the interesting things, which would support Bitcoin still outperforming the altcoin market for at least for maybe another month or two, is the dollar. And when you look back at the dollar in 2016, one of the fascinating things about it in 2016 was that it was also going up in Q4, right? I mean, here it was weak in August, September, just like it was over here. And then in October, the dollar went up 3%. November, it went up another 3%. And then it topped out the following month or two. Here, it's already up 2%. which this is important because it shows you, it tells you why there's been this relative weakness by ETH against Bitcoin. When the dollar goes up, net liquidity goes down, and that's not good for alt Bitcoin pairs. It doesn't necessarily mean anything bad for alt USD pairs, but for alt Bitcoin pairs, that's not necessarily a good thing. So there's another similarity here with 2016 potentially and 2024, where the dollar goes up into the end of the year, right? So I think that's an interesting comparison to make. Now, of course, there's some nuances to it, right? I mean, just because 2016 looks like 2024 in that regard, it doesn't mean like it's that way in every comparison. And one of the ways it has looked different so far, although it could get back on track, is that in 2016, there wasn't really the same lower high structure that's developed. I mean, there were a couple of highs where Bitcoin consolidated from, but it kept on moving up, right? And here you can see that September was green, October was green. I mean, there wasn't this long period of consolidation. This long period of consolidation looks a lot more like what we got over here in 2019, which we've been making the comparisons to quite frequently. So why does it look different, right? I think part of it could be the sort of the macro uncertainty, right? I mean, the dollar looks very similar in terms of what it's doing right now, but perhaps it could be related, to the unemployment rate. And look, guys, I will be the first to tell you, there's not a single person that can predict when a recession is going to occur, especially and including me. But it could be that this going up has given some investors pause, and is why Bitcoin has not been moving up like it was in 2016 throughout the year. Because in 2016, Bitcoin mostly just went up throughout the entire year, whereas in 2024, that hasn't really been the case, right? It put in a top in March, but then it's been lower highs ever since, right? If you look at 2016, there was a high in, you can see that Bitcoin broke out to new highs here in May. There was a top in June, and then Bitcoin took out the June high in December, right? But it just kind of kept on putting in new highs. Whereas this time, it's still just putting in lower highs. So I think it's a combination of the 2016 view and the 2019 view. And when you mix these two views, you get something that looks like this, where it's kind of a slight downtrend like this, but it's not as bad of a downtrend. Probably because in terms of seasonality, it's more so in this range, right? So remember, if Bitcoin does go up in Q4, that's what it did in 2016. And you could have a scenario where ETH goes down in Q4, even if Bitcoin goes up. Doesn't have to be the base case, but it could happen. Now, if Bitcoin goes down in Q4, does that completely derail the whole cycle? I would argue that it would not. Right now, first of all, there's a good chance it doesn't go down in Q4. If you look at, if we go over here back to the website and we just look at, say, quarterly returns, right? If we look at quarterly returns for Bitcoin in Q4, 2020 was green, 2016 was green, 2012 for Bitcoin was green, right? So they've all been green. 2019 was red, right? And that was the year the Fed cut rates. So it makes sense to at least keep that in the back of your mind, right? I'm not saying that it has to mean that. I own Bitcoin, guys. I know that I do. I own Bitcoin. I mentioned that I traded my altcoins to it a few years ago. I bought some in late 2022, DCA when the risk level calls for it. That's my main crypto portfolio. It's just Bitcoin and some ETH. Right? But I think that right now, we're still looking at a red Q4, but we're only, we're not even 2 weeks in. A lot can change. The question is if it plays out like the last two cycles, then Bitcoin goes up in Q4. You can't ignore it, right? You can't ignore that view. That's what's happened in the last two cycles, is that it went up in Q4 of the halving year. The question I'm asking is, what if it doesn't, right? Well, what if Bitcoin, throws us a curveball and it doesn't? And I don't know what it would look like if it doesn't. But soon enough, we're going to get into that third week of October, third to fourth week, which is normally when Bitcoin does pretty well, right? I mean, even in 2019, you can see that that week of October was pretty bullish. Last year, it was pretty bullish, right? 2020, same thing, right? So Bitcoin's main resistance level is going to be coming up somewhere up here, right? 67K, 68K. If it can get through that, then and hold that as support, then you're probably just looking at a Q4 halving year that looks like every other Q4 halving year, and everyone's just trying to overcomplicate it. If it's rejected, right? If it's rejected, let's say Bitcoin rallies up into it, and then there's a bad data point somewhere, and then the market gets spooked again, kind of like it got spooked over here. This was at the beginning of a month, when the labor market data came out. This was too. This was as well. And so if it sells off again, does that derail the cycle? I would say no, right? I would say no. So, and the reason I would say no is because if you look at the ROI from the low, we would expect diminishing returns, right? So it's not like it has to keep pace with this cycle, right? If it follows what 2019 ended up doing, that's fine, right? It's fine for it to do that. I said 6 to 9 months. It's already been 7 months. So it could be that the low is in for Bitcoin for this year, or maybe you get one more lower low, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to derail the entire cycle if that happens. The reason why you could argue that view is because, first of all, there is an ebb and flow to this, but if you measure the ROI after the cycle peak, Bitcoin's currently ahead of the last 2 cycles. And if you look at it, just as measured from November of 2021, it's actually back to where the last cycle was at this point in the cycle. But what's really fascinating is when you compare to the 2016 cycle, it's still very much ahead of where it was in that cycle at this point in the cycle. As measured from the peak right now, Bitcoin is basically 7% down from the all-time high. But in 2016 cycle, it was still 37% down from the all-time high, right? 37% down from the 2021 high would put Bitcoin at 42K, right? I mean, it would put it all the way back down here again, which again would be near the 100-week moving average, right? So this is how I think it makes sense to play it, right? And I've said this for years, right? I've said this for years. Bitcoin heavy still makes sense to me, right? I still think dominance is going to 60%. I think it makes sense to hedge with some other stuff, some altcoins that are doing well in their Bitcoin pairs. Absolutely. I think it makes sense to hedge. I want to be clear. But I still do think that Bitcoin dominance will go to that 60% milestone. You got the dollar going up, so you got net liquidity going down. The long end of the yield curve is going up. And normally that, and with rate cuts, with some of the aggressive rate cuts that we're getting priced in, now some of those are getting priced back out. So to me, it would seem to favor that Bitcoin outperforms. The question is it on a Bitcoin rally or is it on a Bitcoin dump? Throughout this year, it's been on both, right? I mean, Bitcoin's basically just been going sideways with a slightly bearish bias. And while that has been going on, Bitcoin dominance has just been going up. So you could get a scenario, right? I think the two scenarios that I think deserve the most attention, right? The most attention, because I wish I could tell you the outcome, right? But the two scenarios that I think deserve the most attention are these two. And I'll draw both of them out, and these are the two that I'm looking at. One of which is, sort of a rally back up, and then there's a pullback early November, and then it gets above it, holds it as support, and then it just continues on, right? That's one view. The other view is where Bitcoin follows Ethereum down. If Ethereum does what it did in 2016 and in 2019, after ETH Bitcoin broke down, ETH USD dropped approximately 70%. And the final drop occurred in Q4. If Bitcoin follows ETH, because maybe the unemployment rate's going up, so it's more so dependent on that than it is the dollar, then it could get rejected, come back down one more time, check in with a 100-week SMA like 2019, and then go up in 2025, right? So there's two scenarios that I think deserve the most attention right now. Now, I told you guys this back over here in, in July. I said that for the 2019 comparison to be complete, we need another lower low at the bottom of this trend line. And people were like, no way, right? There's no way Bitcoin's going to go to 50K. And then it did. And this is why I said we need at least 6 months. We got it, right? We got it. But I said 6 to 9 months. I don't know if that's the low. It could be, right? Or if there has to be one more. Because in 2019, after the low was in, right, after the 2019 view played out, there still was a landing, right? Now, I don't think you're going to get a pandemic style drop, right? But you could still get a landing, right? A soft landing. And I think that is the important thing to look at here is does that actually happen again in Q4? And how strong is Bitcoin going to be if the unemployment rate starts to go back up at the end of the year? Could it shrug it off? Is there enough liquidity in the altcoin market to send Bitcoin higher? Or does it sell off one final time before then going up in 2025? I think those are the two most likely scenarios to look at. But the thing is if you measure it from the low, it might make you think that it has to go up or the cycle gets derailed. But if you look at it from the peak, you're like, we got plenty of time, right? We got tons of wiggle room here, right? Bitcoin could go sideways, let's say, 1,068. Bitcoin could go sideways for another 150 days and still be on track with 2016, 2017 cycle, right? That's how aggressive this move was by Bitcoin earlier on in the cycle. It's also true that it didn't drop as much as it did in 2016. So I think you got to look at that, right? You got to look at that and say, you know what? Bitcoin's still in pretty good shape, all things considered. It had a really great rally early on. It has struggled in 2024 to really continue its move up. But when you look at it from the low, it makes absolute sense why it did. It's because it was so far ahead of the last two cycles. Because when it was up here, right, when this cycle was up here at 4.5x from the bottom, the other two cycles were still only 2 to 2.5x from the bottom. So Bitcoin has gone sideways with a slightly bearish bias for 7 months. Now it's back in line with the prior cycles, right? So I would say it like this. I would say if the unemployment rate keeps dropping in Q4, it would probably favor risk assets to still do well, right? And you could see Bitcoin go up in Q4. Now, technically, ETH could go up in Q4 too, but I think the issue with that is it's more so dependent on looser monetary policy than Bitcoin is. And so if the labor market data comes in better than expected, it could just delay rate cuts, which I think things like Ethereum are really relying on more so than Bitcoin, right? I don't really think Bitcoin is relying on it as much as ETH. But if the unemployment rate, say, shoots back up in, next month, then you might actually see Bitcoin and ETH go back down and then go back up after we get that scare out of the way. But I thought those were two really good ways to look at the market, right? Look at it from the low and say, everyone's trying to overcomplicate this thing, and they have been all year. But in reality, this chart would have told you Bitcoin needs to get back in line with the prior cycles, and then it's got a real chance of moving up. Now it's back in line with the last two cycles. And, it's got a chance. It's got a chance here to move back up to this trend line before the end of October. Right? There's a chance. If it doesn't, right, and if it just sells off again, then I think you go to the next view. ROI after the peak. And that'll show you that there's still plenty of wiggle room here. Right? I mean, again, at this point in the last cycle, Bitcoin was still 37% down from the high, and that would put it at like 44K or something, right? So it shows you, it makes sense to look at it in more than one way sometimes. Now, some people previously were looking at it as measured from April, and I took a look at it a few times because everyone was talking about it. They were talking about a massive rally with an early peak, let's say like earlier this summer. A lot of the gurus were calling for 100K by this summer, right? And they were wrong. And now they're just they just keep saying it. But look, guys, you have to be careful with this stuff. Just because it's tracking a cycle like that does not mean it has to continue doing it. And you can see that it hasn't, right? And a lot of people have gotten chopped up in here because every time it goes up, they buy a lot thinking it's going to go to 100K because everyone's telling them it is, and then it sells off and they panicked at the bottom and sell. If you just, if you just stayed Bitcoin heavy for the last 3 years, who cares, right? It doesn't matter. You just assume that Bitcoin dominance is going to go up and most everything else in the cryptoverse is going to bleed back to Bitcoin as Bitcoin makes its way to a dominance of 60%. So when you measure it from April, we've already fallen behind the last 2 cycles, but I think you need to measure it from November, I think. Price action is king, not the indicators that tell you where the price was topped. Where did price actually top? And it was in November of 2021, not in April. Just like the bear market was from November to November back then, not April to April. Price action is king. The last way to measure the ROI is from the halving, and this is probably the most disappointing one we've had, because you can see that Bitcoin, right now it's still underperforming the last several cycles, and it's basically right around break even. Okay, this has not been the best ROI for Bitcoin after the halving. Counterpoint is this is really the first cycle out of the last 2 that Bitcoin saw new all-time highs before the halving. So it makes sense that it has been a little bit weaker after the halving. So, you'd really like to see that get back in line because as measured from the halving, Bitcoin is really far behind. It's still at 0.97, and last 2 cycles at this point we're at 1.47 and 1.6. So what's going on, right? What's going on? Why is that weakness there? I think a lot of it is, I think the ETFs brought forward a lot of the demand and has then led to this long consolidation period. But also, I imagine that liquidity has had something to do with it, right? Just the Fed reducing balance sheets and also macro uncertainties probably had something to do with it. But you can see that this has played out very similar to 2019 because just like 2019, while Bitcoin trended down, the S&P just kept putting in new all-time highs. And so that's why it makes sense to be diversified, because otherwise you find yourself in a position where, the S&P's been going up for 7 months straight, Bitcoin's been going down for 7 months straight. If you've been diversified some, at least you would have, at least your portfolio hasn't been flat for the last 6 months or slightly down. That's why I think it makes sense to diversify. And there's also no guarantees with any of this stuff, right? I mean, things can happen, bad things can happen. You can get major sell-offs when you least expect it, and that's what happened last cycle, right? I mean, there was the pandemic drop, which no one was expecting. And then we pretty quickly recovered and got back on our merry way. So for me right now, I think it makes sense to look at it as measured from the low and say, look, there's a decent chance Bitcoin just gets a rally in Q4. If it doesn't, and it gets rejected by the top of this, this descending, broadening wedge, right? If it just gets rejected again, then I think you just go and say, look, guys, if you measure from the peak, it would still fall in line with the 2016 cycle. And it would just kind of be it would actually be completing the end of the 2019 pattern, right? So the 2019 pattern has fully played out, right? It's fully played out. The thing that hasn't played out is there a landing or not, right? Is there a soft landing? Is there a hard landing? And I think that if that plays out, maybe after the election or something, then perhaps that would open the door for 2025 for Bitcoin dominance to go down, as then, there would be a lot more looser monetary policy coming in to, hopefully save the day and send the unemployment rate back down. But I do think that this stuff is really interesting to look at. It helps you view the market in different ways. And look, I think a lot of people only want to hear the bullish view or they only want to hear the bearish view. But the reality is both sides have been right and both sides have been wrong for basically the last 7 months, right? And so it makes sense to have a balanced view and say, you know what? We're getting close to the time where seasonality tends to be favorable for Bitcoin. And so maybe if it's going to break out, this year, it seems like it should do it soon, because you got other ones breaking out, right? I mean, you got other things. I mean, like the S&P is putting in new highs again. So I would watch this. Let's see what happens up here. If Bitcoin can break through, or if it just sells off again. And remember, ETH could still go down in Q4. even if Bitcoin doesn't. It's hard to make that the base case just because ETH Bitcoin has already sold off a lot. And so, I mean, while it's possible it could go a little bit lower, I don't think it's going to go that much lower. But, anything's possible, right? Anything's possible. So I would look at those two scenarios, breaking through kind of right now, or one more landing sell off and then breaking through, and then just comparing to these ROI from the low, ROI from the peak, and seeing which one it tends to follow better. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.